Chapter 4, Up the Mountain of Injury, from Hinds on High Places. Finally, Much Afraid was traveling toward the high places. It was amazing how quickly she went with her strong helpers, Sorrow and Suffering. The path was quite smooth, and before long they were near the mountains. As they got closer, Much Afraid began to worry. The mountains looked so steep. In the late afternoon, the path led them to the rocky cliffs. In every direction, the mountains were like walls that went straight up. The cliffs completely blocked their path. There was no sign of a track anywhere, and it would be impossible for them to climb. They would have to turn back. Just then, Suffering pointed to the rocky walls. 2 deer were leaping up the cliff. The Heart led the way, and the Hind followed him exactly. They leaped and sprang in perfect ease up and up the rocky wall and disappeared over the top. Much Afraid began to tremble, and her knees shook. Suffering and Sorrow took her hands in theirs. "Do not be afraid. We don't have to turn around after all. The Heart and the Hind have shown us the way. We will just follow where they went." "Oh, no, no," Much Afraid cried out. "It is impossible. The deer may be able to go up there, but I certainly can't. I would be sure to fall on all of those awful rocks." She began sobbing. "I can't do it. I can't. I'll never be able to get to the high places." And she crouched to the ground, completely exhausted. They heard a crunching sound and a rattling of loose stones, then a voice beside her. "Ha ha, my dear little cousin, we meet again at last." Much Afraid found herself looking right in the face of Craven Fear. "You little fool," he continued. "Did you really think you could escape me for good?" No, Much Afraid, you are one of the Fearings. You will always be one of the Fearings. You'll never change. I have come to take you back to the valley where you belong." "I won't go with you," cried Much Afraid. "Well, you can take your choice," sneered Craven Fear, pointing up to the rocky cliff. "Take a look way, way up there. My, it makes me dizzy just to think of poor little you trying to climb that terrible wall of rock. Just picture yourself slipping and struggling, and oh, what a long way it would be if you happened to fall." "Much Afraid," said her helper, shaking her shoulders gently. "Much Afraid, you know what to do. Call for help." She clung to them and sobbed. "I am afraid to call. I am so afraid that if I call him, he will tell me that I must go that way, that awful, terrible way. It's impossible. I can't face it. Oh, what should I do?" Sorrow bent over her and said gently but firmly, "You must call for him, Much Afraid. Call for him at once." "I can't," she trembled. "This time I just can't." Craven Fear stepped forward and laughed loudly. Quickly, her 2 helpers put themselves between him and Much Afraid. Then Suffering looked at Sorrow, who nodded back. Suffering reached and poked Much Afraid sharply, as only Suffering can. Much Afraid cried out and looked around helplessly. Then she did what she should have done the moment that they had reached the impossible-looking wall. She called to the shepherd. "Shepherd, help me! My fears are more than I can handle." As she lifted her voice, Craven Fear scurried away. "Hello, Much Afraid," the shepherd greeted her brightly. "What is the matter? Don't be afraid, I'm here." He sounded so cheerful and so full of strength that Much Afraid felt as if a stream of courage was flowing into her from his presence. She had been worried that he might be angry with her for listening again to her fears. She sat up and looked at him and saw that he was smiling, with no trace of anger in his face. Thankfulness filled her heart, and the icy fear melted away. "Much Afraid?" he said gently. "Tell me what is the matter. Why were you so afraid?" "It is the way you have chosen for me to go," she whispered. "It looks so impossible. I feel like I might faint whenever I look up. The deer can go up there, but not a limping, crippled jellyfish like me. But much afraid. What promises did I make to you in the valley? The shepherd asked with a smile. Much afraid looked surprised. Then fear crept into her heart again. You promised you would make my feet like Hinds' feet and that I would run and leap on the high places, she said weakly. Well, he answered cheerfully, the only way to do that is to go on the paths that the hinds use, like this one. Much afraid trembled. Then I don't think I want hinds' feet, she said. Instead of being disappointed, the shepherd actually laughed. Oh, yes, you do, he said cheerfully. I know you better than you know yourself, Much Afraid. You want hinds' feet very much. In fact, that is why I brought you to this side of the mountains. Here the cliffs are very steep, and the only way up is the tracks that the deer use. So the promise I made to you will start to come true. What did I say to you the last time we met? You said, now you will see what I will do, she answered. But I never dreamed you would do something like this. It's too... She fumbled for words, then suddenly burst out laughing. Why, it just doesn't make sense. Whatever will you do next? The shepherd laughed too. I love doing things that don't seem to make sense, he replied. Well, I don't know anything more delightful than turning weakness into strength, fear into faith, and something crooked into something beautiful. The thing I would most enjoy right now is turning a jellyfish into a mountain goat. That is my special work, he added with a great joy in his face. Taking Much Afraid, for example, and changing her into... He broke off laughing. Well, we shall see what she finds herself changed into. What a difference the shepherd had made. A short time ago, Much Afraid had been full of fear and worry. Now she and the shepherd were sitting together on the rocks laughing. Come now, little jellyfish, said the shepherd. Do you believe that I can change you into a mountain goat and get you to the top of this rocky cliff? Yes, she answered. Then she knelt and built a little altar like the one she had made before going into the desert. On it, she laid her will, her desire to do what she wanted instead of what he wanted. Fire came from somewhere, and she found among the ashes a larger and rougher stone than any of the others. She placed it carefully into the little bag and stood up. The shepherd spoke. This cliff leads up to Mount Injury. Injury means being hurt and treated wrongly. On the way here, you have been learning the lessons of acceptance with joy. Now it is time to learn a new lesson. As you meet injury and overcome it, you will discover what the new lesson is. The shepherd gently put his hand on her and blessed her. Then he called her helpers and pulled out a strong rope from a crack in the rocky wall. He carefully tied them all together. Sorrow was in front and suffering behind, with Much Afraid in the middle. So the two were so strong and sure-footed, they went before and after to keep her safe. Then the shepherd gave her a small bottle. He told her that if she felt weak or faint on the way up, to drink a little from it. The label on the bottle read, Spirit of Grace and Comfort. Much Afraid tried a drop or two and immediately felt stronger and ready to begin the climb. By this time it was late afternoon. The shepherd told them to begin at once. There is a cave further up the cliff, which you can't see from here. You can rest there tonight. If you stay down here tonight, your enemies will be sure to pay you a visit. They won't follow you up the cliff, but, he added warmly, you will probably meet them again when you have reached the top. With that, he smiled brightly, and Sorrow put her foot on the narrow little track which zigzagged up the rocky wall. Much Afraid followed next, and then Suffering. They were on their way up Mount Injury. Once on the track, Much Afraid discovered to her surprise that it wasn't nearly as hard as it had looked. It was very steep and slippery, but because she had was tightly roped between sorrow and suffering and had the tiny bottle of the Spirit of grace and comfort, Much Afraid felt quite safe. She didn't look down unless she had to, and once when she did dare to look, she was very thankful that the shepherd had told them to start climbing right away. Sitting on the rocks were all 5 of her enemies, looking up angrily. She remembered the shepherd's warning that she would probably meet them at the top. She wondered how they would get there and realized that there must be some other way they could use. The 3 steadily climbed higher and higher. They arrived at the cave just as darkness fell. Right beside the entrance was a tiny waterfall. They were thankful for a refreshing drink from its waters. Inside the cave were piles of sheepskins they could use to rest on, and Sorrow and Suffering pulled out packages of dried fruit and nuts the shepherd had given them. They ate gratefully, then fell into a deep and peaceful sleep. Much Afraid woke early the next morning and walked to the entrance of the cave. She looked out to try to get a view of things from her high window. As far as the eye could see was the desert and lonely sea. The fruit orchards that they had passed through were out of sight, and everywhere she looked it was cold, empty, and sad. Even the rocky wall they were on looked even harder and more awful than she remembered. Just then she looked up at the cliffs beside the tiny waterfall. To her delighted surprise, there was a beautiful little plant. It was growing in a tiny crevice of rock and on its stem. There it grew, a single flower. Much Afraid stared at the brilliant red petals. "What is your name, little flower? I have never seen another like you before." "My name is Bearing with Love," the little plant seemed to whisper, "but some call me Forgiveness." Much Afraid realized at once that this was the new lesson the shepherd wanted her to learn. "Why is that your name?" she asked. A little whispering laugh seemed to pass through its leaves. "I was taken away from my family and friends and put in the prison of this rock. The ones who did this left me alone, not caring what happened to me. But I didn't stop loving, and love helped me push through the cracks. Now look at me. What flower is more blessed and satisfied than I?" Much Afraid looked at the flower's tiny glowing petals and wanted to be like it was. She knelt beneath the imprisoned flower and whispered, "Here I am. My name will be Bearing with Love, too. No matter how I am hurt or mistreated, I will choose to forgive." At that moment, a piece of rock, which imprisoned the roots of the flower, loosened and fell at her feet. She picked it up and gently added it to the others in her bag. Sorrow and Suffering were waiting in the cave with a breakfast of bread, raisins, and nuts. Then the 3 roped themselves together again and once more began to climb Mount Injury. After a little time, they came to a place that was very steep. Suddenly, Much Afraid slipped and cut herself quite badly on the sharp rocks. It was a good thing that she was held so tightly by the rope because her heart filled with fear and she felt like she would faint. She crouched closely to the wall and wept for fear. Immediately, Suffering came up from behind her, held Much Afraid in her arms, and whispered, "Drink a bit from the Spirit of grace and comfort." Much Afraid trembled. "I don't even know where it is." Suffering reached into Much Afraid's pocket and took out the small bottle. She poured a few drops between Much Afraid's lips, and the faintness began to go away, but she still couldn't move. She drank a bit more, and then she felt strengthened. They started to climb again, but it went slowly. In her fall, Much Afraid had cut both knees so badly that she could only limp forward, moaning with pain. Her helpers were very patient, but finally Suffering asked, "What were you doing this morning at the front of the cave?" Much Afraid was startled by the question. "I was looking at a flower I had never seen before, growing in a rock by the waterfall." "What kind of flower was it?" Suffering asked. "It was the flower of Bearing with Love." Much Afraid answered softly, "But some call it Forgiveness." For a few moments she was quiet, remembering the stone she had put in her bag and the lessons she had learned from the beautiful plant. Then she said, "I wonder if it would help if we put a few drops from the bottle on my knees." "That is a very good idea," said Sorrow and Suffering together. "Let's try." As they dropped a little of the Spirit of grace and comfort on her knees, the bleeding stopped and the worst of the pain disappeared. Her legs were still quite stiff, and she still limped, but the three were able to move forward. By late afternoon, they reached the top of the rocky wall and came to a forest of young pine trees with moss and blueberries growing beside the path. They sat down on a mossy bank to rest and heard a voice coming toward them, singing. It was the shepherd. He sat beside them and cheerfully praised them for reaching the top of Mount Injury. He gently laid his hands on Much Afraid's wounds, and immediately they disappeared. Then he began to speak to them about where his new path would lead. You will now go through the forest of danger and tribulation. Tribulation means big trouble. The path may get quite dark, and there will be storms along the way. Stay close to each other. Remember that as long as you stay on my path, nothing can really hurt you. The forest of danger and tribulations, Much Afraid cried. Oh, shepherd, wherever will you lead me next? To the next place on your journey, to the high places, he answered with a smile. To places which will help you develop Hinds feet. Trust me, Much Afraid. She looked down at her feet. They seemed more crooked than ever. Then Much Afraid lifted her head and looked into the eyes of the shepherd. I will trust you to do as you have promised, she said softly. Whatever path you lead me on, I will not fear because you are with me. She knelt and built another altar and added yet another stone to her bag. Then Much Afraid started on the path which leads to the forest of danger and tribulation.